About medium to large dog size.
Yeah, and they had toes, which is so weird to me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I found it kind of creepy or something.
Is that the first time you heard about that?
Yeah.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, hello, everybody.
And today we are super excited to get a start on a brand new book titled Hoof by William T. Taylor. This is one we've been talking about doing for a while. Barbara in particular, being the horse person that she is very excited about it and has wanted me to do it. So let's do it. Before we get into that, we here at Archaeology Books for Fun are so grateful that we get to share our love and passion of archaeology and the past with you. You can help us out too by sharing this podcast with family and friends. You can also drop us a like, comment, subscribe, or review. We really appreciate those comments in particular. We just love hearing from you all and hearing what your thoughts on the episodes are. Also, if you want to support the podcast financially, you will find a donation link in the description. All right, so yeah, starting off a new book. It's been a little while since we've gotten to start a new book.
And I'm so excited about this one as a self-proclaimed horse girl. So
yes.
Where are all my horse girls at? This is a book for you.
And even if not, there's still, horses are cool. They're fascinating, especially in a historical, archaeological perspective, as we will learn.
Yeah.
The book comes in what is titled as 4 Hoofbeats. Yeah. So we decided to basically do a hoofbeat an episode. So this will be the first hoofbeat we're talking about today. And being the start of the book, we start off with a prelude, or it's more of a prelude than a straight up introduction, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it sets the tone a little bit.
Yeah, it sets the tone. That's what I was going to say.
It's
pretty good at setting the tone and just kind of giving you a little bit of background on the author and where his interest is from.
Yeah, he uses the prelude as an opportunity to kind of set the tone. Like you'd expect, establishes, horses are important, kind of sets that up a little bit. The kind of narrative focus for this part is about him visiting an archaeological site.
More and more.
Yes,
if
in
I'm
Mongolia.
saying that right.
So there are several things that feature in this archaeological site in particular. There are several stone stela that mark, I think, burials. Yeah. And there are some carvings in these burials, and then there are a bunch of buried horse parts around them. And so it's pretty impressive, very poetic description of the valley. I kind of want to go see it now. And then apparently one cliff face, when the light catches it right, you can see hoof prints carved into the cliff face. And I noticed that the author did include photos of these things, but some of what he was describing, it required like a specific time of day to have the full effect.
Right.
And the photos didn't have that full effect, so which was a little disappointing, but I could see what he meant still. But yeah, good setup.
And I do like how the author uses this as a point to say, archaeological records are messy.
Mm-hmm.
And as they say, fraught with trial and error, mistakes, revisions, and debate. And I always like to reiterate that every chance I get, because science and including archaeology are not these concrete things, right? Like things change, and that's okay.
Yeah, I also noticed an observation of it when he's talking about the importance of this site. He says there's lots of research done on the importance of horses, but it's using historic documents, and these sites really represent why archaeology matters.
Yeah, and archaeology can do it can at least heavily contribute to what we already know, or what we think we already know, I should say.
Or as we always say, it can tell the untold stories. It can tell us the things that aren't written down anywhere else in the world.
Right.
And that's definitely true, especially for today's episode, because chapter 1 starts with the beginning of time, basically.
Yeah.
When we started with, relationships with horses and people, I was not expecting the asteroid that crashed and killed the dinosaurs.
I know, yeah, that kind of took me for a spin. We're going in the way, way back machine.
Yeah, like when I say beginning of time, that's less facetious than I was expecting.
Yeah, but this chapter is mostly, or exclusively, I guess, about the origin of the horse evolutionary lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so about that time, we have the classic small mammal that branched off and filled a bunch of ecological niches that were vacated by the dinosaurs. And from that, most or all of the mammals of the world kind of came, including us and including horses, is what it boils down to.
Right, yeah. And it gets kind of into the weeds, but I think the author does a really good job kind of parsing that out and making it known what is most relevant to the entirety of this book. I don't know. I found it interesting. I've never really thought about the evolution of horses. I think I've only taken my personal interest of horses into like, I guess what comparatively would be more recent history, like medieval history, things like that.
Right.
He talks a lot about the fossil evidence and, a lot of stuff that might more aptly fall under paleontology to start out, which makes sense. We're talking about the evolution of the animal, right? But the dawn horse was interesting to me. I guess it was like the first, I don't even know if you would call it, would it be a proto horse?
First thing sort of that is recognized as a horse.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. But they had toes. They didn't have hooves.
They were smaller too, a lot smaller.
Yeah, they were I guess like dog sized.
About medium to large dog size.
Yeah, and they had toes, which is so weird to me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I found it kind of creepy or
Is that
something.
the first time you heard about that?
Yeah.
Interesting. I remember seeing fossils about that and everything before, so that wasn't news to me. I'm surprised. It just interested me. So yeah, one of the things that really kicked it off for the horses, I thought this was interesting, was the Ice Age.
Yeah.
They are particularly well adapted for large open prairies and colder climates. And so with the Ice Age, there was lots and lots of that, and there was like all kinds of different horses at different times around the world.
And I thought it was interesting too. The author talks a lot about the difference, like when the horse creatures started to kind of branch off into different animals. The horses were more adapt to colder grassland areas, but then the zebra and the mules kind of developed in other parts of the world where it was hotter.
Yeah, at the end of the Ice Age, there was a dying off of a whole bunch of the different horses. But the zebras and the mules did better because they were adapted to deserts, which were still around.
I thought it was funny, that like a bunch of these horses were dying off, because I was thinking to myself, well, not much has changed, because I feel if you know anything about horses or you have horses, they're always trying to kill themselves in various ways.
Don't seem particularly well adapted sometimes.
Right, yeah.
Of course, we have bred them to be different too.
That's true.
Do horses today still replace their teeth?
I really don't know much about horse teeth. I think the babies, like the younger horses, they do have like baby teeth that fall out.
Apparently at one point, horses were developed so they could chew the harsh grasses essentially to be able to replace their teeth.
And I know like today, it's called floating their teeth, which is essentially like filing them down, because when they're chewing, the way in which they chew, it creates these little nodules on their teeth that can be really uncomfortable. And so sometimes if a horse is acting up or a horse isn't eating, it's because they need their teeth floated. They just need those little spikes essentially ground off their teeth.
But I think there's plenty of detail, of course, in there about the evolution of horses. I think that covers the highlights for me, though. What about you, Barbara?
Yeah, I think to me, the most telling thing was just the fact that, you have the horses, the mules, and the zebras, and that kind of plays into the other chapters as well, the differences between the three and how they developed. And I think another thing I think is important to mention is how horses in the wild develop herds and like their social structure, because I think that comes into play later too, about the harem system and then the bachelor groups. Because I know in future chapters they talk about hunting and how they can tell based on the sex of the horses.
Yep.
So yeah, they have, you find like a lot of females and then fewer males, usually like one or two stallions that like dominate a herd. And then you have these little bachelor groups off doing their own thing as well.
Yep. And that leads us into our next chapter, chapter 2, which is all about basically how horses and humans first interacted. And essentially it was a predator-prey relationship to start with, for sure.
Yeah, which I never really thought much about this either. It like seems obvious, right? And that's one of the unique things about modern horse and people relationships is we have this like, we're predators and we have this weird relationship with a prey animal, but we used to hunt them apparently a lot.
A lot. Yep. Yeah, and it seems like the common tactic, not too surprising, is people would ambush them at watering holes because they're fast animals, and if you remove that, then they're very vulnerable.
Yeah, seems like the way they evolved, and it's talked about in the previous chapter too, is being prey animals, speed was pretty much their only
That in groups. Speed and
defense
groups
mechanism.
were their defenses.
Yeah.
Plus some other things like the ability to sleep standing and not sit down and stuff.
Yeah.
So actually interesting because when they're ambushed at watering hole, it seemed like it wasn't typically just one or two that was killed. Like they would often be killing like the whole herd or most of the herd when they do that. And so the pattern we see archaeologically, what Barbara was kind of alluding to, was when they're killing a whole herd, that herd will typically be mostly female or entirely male.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll see that distinction in the archaeological record.
Yeah.
And that's important when we come to, in the next chapter, which we'll get to in a moment, about how do we know when domestication starts? Because that's a pretty big clue of if they're being hunted or if they are being raised.
And I know in addition to like just, them being at watering holes, it seems like they were also utilizing natural landscape features such as like gorges or valleys, or I don't know what you would call them, but just small places where there was kind of only one way in, one way out.
Which we see with buffalo runs and that kind of a thing as well. Similar idea. Cliffs probably drove them off cliffs sometimes. We do talk a little bit about horses and humans in the Americas first coming in contact, which is interesting because the debate around horses in America, I wasn't aware of that full depth. I knew at one time there were horses in the Americas and then they disappeared, but there is some debate. Well, that we are, I think, pretty confident that some of them are around a lot more recently than we thought.
Yeah,
like
that's what it seems like.
5,000 years ago. And then there's even some debate that maybe they never fully left. There was actually some native horses when Europeans brought horses over. Very interesting. I did note that the author, just because this is something that interests me, this ongoing kind of debate and discussion, the author seemed to fully buy into the idea that people were here before the land bridge was open.
Yeah.
This was written in 2024, by the way, too. So this is a very recent book, which is fine. I did look into the Bluefish Caves site a little bit, which is supposed to be a really old case in the Yukon of horses being present and humans. So they were dated. This is interesting because it was initially excavated in 97 to 87, and the bones were dated 11,000 to 30,000 years ago. But as often goes, these things were contested. There was a lot of doubt around it, especially when you have something like this where there's not other evidence to build off of.
Right.
When you have something as big an outlier like that, it's pretty suspicious. So there's a lot of debate around some of this, but apparently they have gone back and done radiocarbon dating in 2017. And so the author says they were here 24,000 years ago. But I looked at the actual report, and the report says that's the earliest date range. So it's a minor error, but it's still not quite. It's not quite an accurate reporting by the author in this case.
Right. It was a range, not an exact date.
Right, and this was the most extreme range that he listed as the date. They also mentioned Paisley Caves, which they did find some horse bones in. Paisley Caves, we've talked about it before. It is an example of the oldest human feces in North America. And there's been a lot of debate around, is this real or is this accurate? But regardless, it's a pretty important site. And so those two did pop out to me. Another thing I found interesting was the discussion around the apparent extinction of horses in North America. And the author entirely laid that at the feet of climate change, which I remember there being some pretty strong debate at one point at least about how much of an impact humans may have had on those extinction of the megafauna.
Yeah, and I'm always, because think about our previous book, right? And how there was always kind of a combination of factors.
Yep.
So I'm always suspicious when somebody claims that there was one definitive factor that caused an extinction or a major cultural shift or change.
In this case, I could buy that climate caused the extinction because it's a thing we've seen a lot, that climate causes an extinction.
Yeah, I guess that's true. It's different than it just seemed very definitive.
Yeah.
And for something, especially when you take it in combination with the peopling of the New World, which is such a debated topic, to be definitive like that and not say that it had anything to do with people was interesting to me.
Well, I was wondering if I was not up on the debate, and maybe that has been pretty well put to rest.
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
There were some people that were purporting the idea that it was entirely humans that caused the extinction of the megafauna. I never really bought that.
I know, because I think the climate warming was a factor in also a larger human population too. So I think it takes both.
Yeah, and hunting methods and I'm not clear on that, but I remember a sense from the whole debate around humans maybe caused the whole thing was there may be kind of some racist undertones to some of that too. I'm not sure if you picked up on that though at any point.
I don't know. I mean, I definitely could see that. I mean,
yeah. So I'm
but
not confident enough to claim that, but it's interesting to me that there's one explanation being presented when I know of at least one other at one point.
right, yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah. But I did enjoy just, even though kind of at this point we were hunting them and we saw them as prey, we still start to see people using them in art, which we've had fun with recently.
Yes.
Tristan's found some fun artifacts and cave drawings and stuff, and I've been rating them. So follow us on social media for that fun.
We've been having fun. Barbara is a very harsh art critic of ancient art.
Which is funny because I have no artistic talent whatsoever.
Doesn't mean you can't be a critic.
Right, that's true. But they're, figurines, pendants, cave drawings, as I've mentioned. And so when you start to see things in, human art, it's kind of a signifier that they're becoming significant. And so they're at this point, they're kind of starting to shape our human culture or, in art and things. So I think it's fascinating because I've always thought of horses as, I've never thought of them as like food prey, even though I have eaten horse before, but to think of us revering them in that way as prey, it makes sense because we've done that with other animals as well. I've just never seen it from that perspective.
All right. So next we move on to the next stage of human relationship with horses, which is domestication. And so this chapter is all about kind of how difficult it is to figure out when domestication started. Partly it is difficult to define what is domestication. Like you have a very clear image in your head probably of what domestication means. A domesticated animal does these things. But even horses to dogs to cows, that domestication is very different. Is penning an animal domestication? Does it have to be selective breeding? And how do you see these things archaeologically?
Right. And it seems like it's more of a continuum than anything else, right? Which
makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's an evolution of behavioral change in an animal, and that's not going to happen like cut and dry.
Yeah. I like the example of like the domestication and relationship with a chihuahua versus a dog that's guarding a flock of sheep. They're very different, but it's the same species even in that case. And then we're talking about different species here. And so there's a lot of attempts to figure out and a lot of ideas that seem to have been popular for a while and then slowly disproven. One of the things they look for, which I thought was interesting and tied into other discussions we had in the chapter earlier, or in the book earlier, is that one thing you'd expect to see if they're domesticating horses as livestock is you will see the remains of the horses be different. Instead of entirely one gender or entirely another, and all of adult breeding age, you will instead see mostly young males, mostly old females in the archaeological record. So that is one thing they've looked for. That makes a lot of sense to me.
And I know another thing they were looking for is wear marks on the teeth from bits. And I didn't get a chance to look into this, but I'm very curious, and I'm sure you could probably go down a rabbit hole, but the author is making this assumption that everybody used metal bits. And I know there's leather bits, there's rope bits. Some people didn't use bits at all. So I don't understand how that could be useful.
Maybe it's more, this is evidence that a metal bit was used. But the lack of that evidence doesn't mean domestication didn't happen. It's just there is not evidence here.
Yeah, I just feel like it seems like in the past, people have tried to use that as an indicator for this is when domestication happened. And also domestication doesn't necessarily mean they were doing something with the horses that even required a bit at all,
Sure. And they talk about that too. Yeah. And it's likely not. And some of the sites, they thought that they had a site where it was early, and then it turned out for other reasons no.
Yeah.
But some of those they were thinking that they were raising them as livestock and not as
transport or
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, you can look at the skeletal remains. I found this interesting because the author talked about archaeozoology.
Yes. Did that? I was
that threw me.
We always call it zooarchaeology.
Zooarchaeology.
Yeah.
I looked at that a little bit. It seems like it might be a regional thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so some regions of the world might call it archaeozoology, and we call it zooarchaeology.
Zooarchaeology is so much easier to say.
For some reason it is.
It rolls off the tongue so much easier, and it might be just because that's what I'm used to.
Yep. So yeah, zooarchaeology is a study of ancient animal bones in relations to humans. So it's not, animals that died naturally because that's paleontology or biology, but instead we are looking at things that humans interacted with in some way. They raised them, they ate them, whatever the case may be. And then, we go through a series of archaeological sites and kind of how they were studied and what they thought happened, and then the challenges, and then, no, actually we think it is right, and then ultimately we think, no, it's not right.
Right, yeah.
This is how it goes.
Yep,
This is very natural, and this is the way these sorts of things happen. It can make kind of confusing reading a little bit sometimes, but just if you go into this, understand that's it's intended to be working that way.
But I think this is also one of the other indicators, it seems, is finding horse remains in human burial context, too. That's another potential indicator of domestication, but again, not conclusive.
Well, yeah, we're looking at sites ranging 3000 BC-ish for when some of this might have started, but we're ultimately it comes down to the sites they thought were early sites of domestication don't pan out.
Right.
I did very much like kind of the advancement of technology throughout this narrative as well.
Yes.
In particular, I liked the end where he talks about DNA has become a very useful marker.
Mm-hmm.
When they started all this, they couldn't differentiate between wild horse and domestic horse DNA. Now they can.
Right.
They can also, zooarchaeologists can also identify physical traits in fragments of bone instead of needing a more complete skeleton like they used to. So this is just advancement of technology and our understanding.
Well, and they did talk a little bit about, too, the chemical analysis of ceramics and looking for lipids and things like that. And we talked about this, I think, in the last book, and I think we've talked about it in the beer book, too.
In the beer book, Ancient Brews, we talked about it a bunch.
Yeah,
yes.
And they mentioned the milk, the mare's milk, and how they were looking for proteins relating to that. But I guess that they'd have to do further research to be able to dig down to see if it's milk protein or if it's something else.
Initially, I think they were looking for isotopes, and isotopes would tell them the time of year that it held the milk, which they were taking to be springtime, which would imply it was with raised horses.
Yeah.
But since then, we have been able to get in there and look at the
lipids, I think, right?
Lipids, yeah. And they have found that there is not any indication that it held horse milk or fat. Yeah. So that didn't fall. That's kind of how this chapter goes, though. I also thought it was very cool that we can look at their teeth. Not in the shape of it, but we can look in the chemical or the mineral makeup of their teeth and see, did they move large distances? So perhaps they were traded. But also we can look and see, were they fed grain in the winter?
Yeah.
Or something other than, harsh grasses and stuff in the winter.
And I guess I know that we do this with human teeth as well, isotope analysis, to figure out where people come from.
So the concept is when you live in one place, that place has specific minerals in the water and the environment. And as you eat things and drink things in that place, those minerals get incorporated into your teeth enamel. And then, especially at a young age, of course, when that enamel is forming. And then if you moved to another place, your minerals would not match the mineral of that place. So we are actually able to sometimes trace migration populations and such through this.
Yeah. So if I guess
cool, actually.
Yeah, I know. I think it's really interesting, and to be able to use that, I would have never thought, but it makes sense. But to use it on animals as well as people was really cool.
Oh, and we can identify horse proteins in ceramics and in human teeth plaque now that we couldn't do before. So not just, I think lipids were also a part of it, but proteins also now.
Ugh, the word plaque is gross to me.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah. And it's interesting to hear ancient people in plaque, but
Blech.
I'm sure they had it, of course. So I think that wraps us up pretty well for this hoofbeat. What do you think, Barbara? Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I can't think of anything else. It was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. I've never really experienced horse stuff this early in history.
Yeah, I did observe that this is definitely not the easiest read that we've done.
But definitely not the most difficult either.
No, it's I'm actually a little curious as to who the intended audience here is, because it's not academic. but it's very much not an easy read if you're not academic either. Even as someone who's trained in some of this, it's not the easiest read. So not to discourage anyone from reading it, if you like horses, definitely give this a try. Just don't get bogged down in some of the jargon if that bothers you or if you struggle with it. Kind of let that go past you.
And I think some of it is just, he mentions so many sites that it can kind of be an info dump.
A bunch of sites, a bunch of different time periods by name.
But really, I don't think you can get the gist and understand the concepts that are being explained without kind of getting bogged down in that stuff. So if you need to just kind of don't worry if you start forgetting site names and things like that.
There's one sentence I thought summarized my feelings about this being a little more of a challenging read than normal. He talked about how horses may sometimes develop unique damage in the upper dentition. And it's just just say teeth.
Right.
So there are elements of more academic writing in here, but it's definitely not an academic book.
Yeah, that's true.
So just kind of be aware of that. You can decide for yourself if it's up for you, but it's good. There's lots of good information. And I'm looking forward to the next one where I assume at least that we'll start to get into more about the human-horse relationship and how that develops in the first.
Yeah, so Beat 2 is titled The Cart, and it talks about wheels and chariots.
Yeah.
So that should be pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think that's going to help me kind of get grounded a little bit more, because when we're talking millennia, we started 65 million years ago. So when we're talking about those timescales, sometimes it's a little hard to keep up for me, but...
Right. Back when horses had toes. Gross. Yeah. So gross. I don't know why that grosses me out, but it does.
The toes weren't even that long ago. It wasn't that long ago.
It's so gross. I don't know. Yeah. I guess farriers would have a totally different job.
Totally. But yeah, so I think that wraps us up this time. And we're looking forward to hearing from you, and we're looking forward to checking out the next chapter of the book, and we'll see you all then.
All right. Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, the toes. I don't know why, Tristan.